of this year's lectures on forward-looking issues in the humanities. Today is our great honor to have Professor Chia-ju Chang, our colleague and dear friend, with us, and she will give us a talk under the theme of vision for the environmental humanities. Professor Kurt Spellmeyer will moderate today's event, and it's my great honor to introduce him. Professor Kurt Spellmeyer is a professor of English at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and a Roshi 老师 in a lineage of Japanese Obako Zen, 日本黄破宗 Chanzong, that begins with arrival of Yingyuan Longqi in the 17th century. He is also the author of the book Buddha and the Apocalypse, Awakening from a Culture of Destruction, and a contributing editor at Tricycle, the Buddhist Quarterly. In his academic work, he has written on education, rhetoric, critical theory, and the sociology of knowledge. For 27 years, he has also directed the Cold Mountain Zenga in central New Jersey. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Spellmeyer.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and having had the pleasure of reading this paper before, I think everybody's in for a real treat. It's also a great pleasure and honor to introduce Chia-ju Chang, who was, I was on her PhD committee when she was at Rutgers, and I have been amazed and impressed and delighted by her fascinating career. And so let me go ahead and do the formal introduction, and then I can turn this over to our colleague. Chia-ju Chang is professor at Brooklyn College, CUNY, in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. Her research interests include Chinese and comparative eco-criticism, multi-species and critical animal studies, eco-cinema studies, and eco-Buddhist studies. She is the author of The Global Imagination of Ecological Communities, Western and Chinese Eco-Critical Praxis. She has edited an anthology, Chinese Environmental Humanities, Environing at the Margins, and co-edited 2 volumes, Eco-Criticism in Taiwan, Identity, Environment, and the Arts, and Heart of the Animals, Contemporary Critical Animal Studies Anthology. Her articles in both English and Chinese have appeared in many peer-reviewed journals, including Asian Cinema, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, Journal of Chinese Cinemas, Journal of Modern Chinese Languages and Literatures, Paragraph, and Prism, as well as numerous scholarly collections in the US, China, and Taiwan. Starting this summer, she will be the chair of her department, and I'm sure we can all commiserate with her. So let me now introduce you to Chia-ju.
Well, thank you, Kurt, for the introduction. I am glad that the Research Center of Humanities and Social Science of National Zhongxin University is hosting my talk again. I believe this is the first time I gave a talk online at Zhongxin. And I'd like to thank my dear friend and the former director of the center, Professor Chen-Shu Qing, for inviting me back. I always consider Zhongxin as my home institute in Taiwan, and I miss going to Taichung to teach, attending workshops, and giving talks. Staying at Shu Qing's place, eating her yummy meals. And in addition to express my gratitude to Shu Qing, I also like to thank Dr. Chen Youting and Liao Yiru for all the hard work behind the scenes. So let me, without further ado, let me just, the PPT is already here. So I want to begin my talk with a very brief history of eco-criticism in the West and situate the success story in the context of the current Anthropocene or climate change crisis to explore what eco-criticism success story means for us, eco-critic, environmental humanist, or humanists in general, who are concerned with our current Anthropocene condition. I hope to reframe eco-criticism as a kind of scholarship I called absence. Let me see if I could, absence scholarship. And for now, I will define it as a scholarly practice that pays attention to the yin aspect, yin as in yin yang, the yin. It is a critical practice that tends to the pre-discursive, repressed, private, useless, or meaningless, and seemingly apolitical that often slip under our eco-critical attention. The idea of the slow, invisible structural violence, or dark ecology, or Lacanian psychoanalysis, or Lyotard's psychic ecology can be considered as falling into this territory of yin ecology. This absent scholarship or yin eco-criticism is distinguished from the yang eco-criticism, a scholarly practice that tends to focus on a more visible, representational, issue-driven, political, or ostensibly activist. And in this sense, many of the projects I did in the past, such as critical animal studies, garbage discourse, would fall into this more activist yang eco-criticism category. And in recent years, I find myself moving more towards the yin aspect of looking at things, for example. In my article, Life Outside the Dome, the possibility of aerophilia in the Anthropocene, I pay attention to the yin dimension and explore the repressed pre-modern qi, or wu, mist, as in wu mai de wu, consciousness, as a hidden repressed eco-specter of modernity. And in this talk, I will continue with this yin eco-criticism and turn from my study of mist or wu in modernity to the topic of nihilism, nihility, and Buddhist nothingness or shunyata to develop what I called soteriological eco-criticism, 禅中修行导向的生态批评 as a pharmacon for the Anthropocene end time. Eco-criticism emerged in the late 1980s in North America, has become one of the fastest growing fields in humanity. I remember in 2004, I joined my colleague Scott Slovik's panel and gave a presentation on Lu Chuan's Kekashili, The Mountain Patrol. As many of you might know this film already, it is about the poaching of the endangered species of Tibetan antelope. The questions we received after our presentation had little to do with the content. And instead, we were grilled by the audience on our methodology and our eco-critical mission. That is, why was the environment or animals the subject of critical attention or aesthetic focus? Why would that matter? Now, okay, it's too early. Now, after almost 20 years, no one would challenge the validity of eco-criticism. The film has skyrocketed and expanded to what is now called environmental humanities. The majority of humanists and cultural workers are jumping on the bandwagon to address the most pressing issues, such as climate change. As an eco-critic, I find myself in an awkward situation. That is, the success of eco-criticism is in proportion to the plummeting well-being of ecosystems and the quality of eco-lives. Such a pyrrhic success certainly deserves more sober scrutiny. That is, if we examine our success story against the backdrop of Anthropocene end time, should we reframe the success as the opposite or something else? Is the success story an Apollonian illusion, to borrow Nietzsche's expression, disguising the inconvenient Dionysian truth that we are in fact doomed? Here I borrow Royce Granton's phrase, as in the title of his book, "We are all doomed, what now?" If we live up the Apollonian facade of the fast-growing field of eco-criticism as a success story, We must come to terms with the fact that its success is in fact a symptom of the reality of end time. The wildfires, the droughts, extreme weather events resulting from the climate change are the very things that drives increased interest in our chosen field of study. Here, the revelation is ironic. Our careers, in a sense, depends on our failure. So it's like garbage collector, we have no jobs if we stop producing garbage. In a way, we eco-critic our garbage collectors as we are trying to clean out the trash of the Anthropocene. Despite our work as eco-critics, the environment keeps getting worse, which implies that whatever we're doing isn't enough or isn't working or not hitting on the right spot. So it seems to me that in this particular historical juncture that we need to pause for a minute to do a little bit of soul searching and to reflect what is missing or misdiagnosed in our field. So the question seems to me become, how should we do eco-criticism differently? And how can non-Western perspectives, such as Buddhism, contribute to the eco-critical project of diagnosis and healing? Eco-criticism is a movement that has gone through several stages of transformation, and there's no doubt that this critical field has a relentless momentum and commitment to sharpening our critical visions and scopes. And this, of course, includes challenging the methodological conventions to which we have been subscribing. But I would like to evoke Sean Cubitt's call for a form of eco-critical praxis beyond the conventional practice of studying theories and applying them to texts, such as identifying and analyzing a body of explicitly environmentalist works. Instead, he nudges us to tend to our theoretical blind spots rather than seeing eco-critical praxis as a form of discursive or referential circularity. I second his view about his mission of eco-criticism. And in this current project, I want to pinpoint what I consider is the issue at stake that we have been blind to. Here, I argue that our blind spot or absence in the Anthropocene end time is the problem of meaning, or what I call the compulsion for meaning. In my opinion, the compulsion for meaning risks clouding our ability to think about the connection between the success story of eco-criticism and the doomsday scenario in the Anthropocene end time. Our compulsion for constructing meaning creates more problems than it solves. In this talk, I'm going to show that it is not a trivial matter to explore the compulsion for meaning in time of crisis because it misleads us into demonizing its rival, nihilism. And in this talk, continuing with the train of thought, I would like to go against the grain to argue that our cultural malady, in fact, is compulsion for meaning, or neophobia, not nihilism. And not only that, I propose that nihilism, together with its close relatives, including nihility, nothingness, zeroness, and the Buddhist idea of emptiness, can be retooled as our cultural and spiritual technology, which will ease the transition from the Anthropocene epoch into the post-Anthropocene order. Humanity has gone through 2 years of COVID. The global pandemic has devastated the denizen of planet Earth. Even in the first world, let me see if that is, okay, nice. Okay, even in the first world, countries such as the United States lost over 1 million lives in this pandemic. As the pandemic becomes endemic, we suddenly found ourselves on the verge of World War III. And even as we are immersed in the horror of the Russian-Ukraine war, The drama of the environmental crisis has not abated. It is not in the mainstream media spotlight. Last week, 5,000 people in Iraq were admitted to hospital due to ongoing severe dust storms. And it is predicted that the Iraq could face quote unquote 272 days of dust a year in the coming decades. We are only in mid-May, and Delhi in India has already hit 49.2 Celsius. And let's not forget that in 2018, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change officially issued a warning that the planet is only 12 years away from the catastrophic global warming. There's no doubt we are in the Anthropocene end time. And what we're facing is a co-emergence or overwhelming large-scale events. In responding to this unprecedented crisis, we see a prevalent compulsion for meaning as our unconscious reflex to cope with the apocalypse. I think it's here. Okay. Apocalypse is ultimate nihilism, not just because the annihilation of physical world, such as climate change, but also in the sense that if humans are the meaning producers, so if humans are gone, then all meaning is gone. In responding to the Anthropocene apocalypse, we see mainstream culture and popular media respond to the crisis by fending off the haunting specter of apocalyptic nihility. They resort to meaning as the legitimate way to restore order. And as such, our obsession for meaning production to generate more action prevents us from recognizing that the grasp for meaning is a symptom of the crisis, but also in return contribute to the crisis. Now, I'd like to give a couple examples to illustrate just how meaning is a symptom or a contributor rather than a solution to whatever crisis we encounter. I will take the COVID tragedy as a first example. The tragedy is definitely related to our construction of meaning because the refusal to wear masks and get vaccinated is not a simple question of best health practices, but arises from a vehemently believed principle held by a certain group of people. For example, the anti-mask people believe that this violates their individual liberty, a core tenet that many people espouse. A report shows that, it's here. A report shows that 300,000 deaths in the United States could have been saved by vaccination. And to be clear, these vaccines are available. People just weren't taking them. And this is a tragic example of how the meaning drive for a symbolic freedom transform masks from an epidemiological question into a suicidal political statement. The next example I want to discuss concerning how meaning is a symptom or contributor of crisis rather than solution is Putin's war against Ukraine. What we see is not a battle between Western democratic values and Russian nihilism, as the West or humanity in general has a tendency to see the cultural order as nihilist. Rather, it is a battle between the West post-World War II vision of a world order and Putin's nostalgia for Russia's lost 19th or 20th century imperialism. Let's see. Our natural inclination to create meaning is so powerful that we only see nihilism as a cultural malady and fail to recognize that this is a unique problem of our species. That is, we are willing to fight for abstract principles, ideologies, and identities predicated on the meanings we construct, even to martyr ourselves for them. In this sense, in combating nihilism, we have in fact turned meaning into poison instead of a cure. In other words, We have weaponized meaning for our own self-defense vis-a-vis crisis. All the terrorists that we see in the United States or elsewhere are not driven by nihilism, but by a very specific ideology that one embraces in reaction to the ideology of the cultural order. So the blind spot in our society is that our cultural malady is not so much nihility, but in fact the malady of meaning. Now I'm moving on to talk about human compulsion for meaning in the Anthropocene. The thing we call meaning is never separate from our activities. We make things as an expression of our desire, or what we think is important. So capitalist production is not just hedonistic, but also an expression of what we value. The stream mind for Cole is us carving a meaning infused statement into the planet. That the energy we need for industry is more important than the natural landscape that was there before. To help clarify, the same way I create meaning by carving my name into a tree is created when we as a culture carve stream mines into mountains. So now, it now probably makes sense for me to say that on a geological level, we are also build, drilled, bleach, and dump meanings onto our physical environment, imprinting monetary, cultural, historical, utilitarian values onto everything. The new geologic epoch called the Anthropocene is a reminder of our meaning-driven compulsion to rub our anthropocentric value onto things to justify ownership, dominance, and violence. Humanity has now willed meaning onto every inch of the planet, in the anthrosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, and atmosphere. If we think of meaning as a building block of narrative, then the Anthropocene can be understood as a collection of all our individual human meaning-driven imprints left on the world, combining to form a grand narrative. Moving beyond our conventional way of seeing the text, now with the Anthropocene, we can see the whole planet has become a living Anthropocene text. Let me use the ice core that are pulled out of the glacier as by scientists at the pole as an example of what I mean by the Anthropocene narrative, or the meaning in the bubbles. The image you see on the screen is a diagram of a typical ice core. And inside the ice core, we can see all the tiny bubbles trapped inside, stratified in layers over time, and every bubble contains air from the past moment in time, and a recorded collection of moments provides a kind of narrative text of the world atmospheric history. These bubbles not only reveal natural history, but also capture material residue of the past, especially carbon dioxide level, and this is charged with intentions and values. In this case, of the particular ice core, the bubble at the bottom of the ice can be traced all the way back to 1750, as you can see here. So it has captured at least over, at least like 400 years, maybe more, of information since the Industrial Revolution. Here we can read the ice core as a trapped text that contains industrial meaning. These are the traces and marks of our industrial and capitalist progression or colonialization of the planet. And in these slides, I am going to use a plastic bird nest as another example of this type of the Anthropocene narrative. And this time it's human meaning as refuse. This is a photo I took, the nest, the bird nest photo I was talking about. a photo I took last year when I was in Taiwan. My friend took me to Sanzhi, which is located in the northeast area, Beihai'an Xian. We visited Sanzhi Tourist Center, a lovely town there. As we were strolling along the beautiful park, enjoying the rural scenery, I noticed several birds' nests that were made partially of plastic waste. So if you look at, take a close look at the lower left image of the screen, you can see the plastic scraps interwoven into twigs and leaves, and now part of the bird's home. This is not nihilism, and I'll discuss nihilism in just a minute. This is a human meaning as refuse, another example of it, the Anthropocene narrative that again and again tell us just how our story about the story of our values, that is, our consumerist lifestyle, energy consumption, disposable pattern of behavior is interwoven with the natural world. All of these reflect a certain capitalist value, the meaning of which is expressed via what we make, consume, and discard. This is a narrative of our capitalist disposable functionality, which is inscribed in the very material form of the plastic bags. From all the human and environmental examples I gave above, the COVID tragedy, the mass shooting. Oh, I didn't have time to talk about the mass shooting in Buffalo that just happened like a couple of days ago. And there was another shooting, right, in California. One Taiwanese doctor was killed. Putin's war, industrial bubbles in the ice cores, and the plastic-infused nest in Taiwan. The pattern here is obvious. We, either an ethnic we or a species we, tend to locate ourselves as a producer of meaning. Whether intentional or unintentional, meaning has become a totalizing, colonizing force, either ideologicalized or materialized in the form of toxic ideology or toxic waste. In this sense, meaning is a form of yin, as in yin-yang, yin violence against the other. What is worth pointing out is this: just as we, as dualistic Cartesian subjects, are prone to perceiving ourselves as the center of meaning production, we are also prone to identify the eruption of the estranged other, be it a thing, an event, hypo-object, like the Timothy Morton liked to call it, or the real, or whatever you want to call it. In our collective symbolic order, we like to call all of this nihilistic. And mainstream culture, as the mainstream culture's ideological machine, the dream factory of Hollywood is responsible for promoting much of these misidentification. That is to misidentify nihilism, the in aspect, as the enemy of the Anthropocene. Take the superhero film genre as an example. The dualistic black and white, good versus evil narrative always portray the superhero as the protagonist who possesses meaning and values, fighting against the nihilistic villains who are represented as the source of violence, destruction, and evil. For example, the Joker here, the Joker in The Dark Knight, and the Dr. Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs are archetypal representation of nihilists as antisocial, atheist, terrorist, destructive, indifferent, and evil, either driven insane or simply considered insane because of their genius has given them too clear a picture of the world. For sure, capitalism won't promote a pure nihilist. Such a negative representation of nihilists as terrorists menacing to our society reflects the Western or modern compulsion for meaning. In this sense, these superheroes mirror what we witness in reality, a fight for meaning or ideology. But the world destroyer will burn all the money he stole because he just wants, here, the one on the lower side, he just wants to watch the world burn, as represented by the Joker in The Dark Knight, is almost non-existent in reality. In fact, no party in real life are nihilists. They imagine they are heroes and pursue their own forms of meaning. Just as in the fictional story where the villains are nihilists, we also imagine our real-life opponents to be nihilists. For example, historically, Western colonialism was justified by bringing the light of Christianity to the heathens. We see a similar meaning-driven pattern when George W. Bush accused the Al-Qaeda for hating our freedom. He was saying that they are denying one of our core source of meaning. And this is exactly the kind of accusation of others as nihilists. The dream factory of Hollywood therefore reveals a collective fear, the fear of negation, especially in modern and capitalist culture that has little tolerance for all the qualities such as nihility, uselessness, valuelessness, or zeroness, because it cannot be exploited. What can we make, let's see, how can we make profit if we question or annihilate people's desire for something or thirst for power? In what Charles Taylor calls the secular age, or what Nietzsche calls the age of nihilism, human constructed meaning has replaced the transcendent as the source of meaning and becomes the new mimetic object of desire among different human groups for vying legitimacy. The capitalist Anthropocene's profound fear is the fear of nihility. Let's see. The capitalist Anthropocene's profound fear is the fear of nihility. The fear of nothingness has morphed into the image of an evil villain in popular imagination, whereas in reality, both heroes and criminals are indistinguishable mimetic rivals in the fight for meaning or truth. Take Adam McKay's social satire, Don't Look Up, is a perfect example of this kind of a mimetic rivalry over meaning. Don't Look Up is a film about two scientists starring Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio, who discover a comet that is about to hit the Earth in 6 months. Vis-a-vis this impending, let me see. Oops. Oh, okay. Vis-a-vis this impending apocalypse, America, instead of dealing with the problem, slip into ideological camps driven by their competing slogans. So we've got one camp that says just look up, and the other camp, don't look up. The mimetic rivalry becomes so partisan that it essentially becomes about the slogan themselves. By wearing hats for competing sports teams, as we see in the dice here. In a way, serious issues such as climate change winds up becoming nothing but sports rivalries. The term nihilism emerged in the 18th century as a response to the decline of Christian theology and the rise of rational thinking and modernity. As such, it is often perceived as a discourse of crisis, as it aimed to challenge the legitimacy of meaning and value. The word nihilism derived from its Latin origin, nihil, which means nothing, or which that does not exist. Nihil is embedded in the verb to annihilate, which means to bring to nothing or to destroy completely. When Nietzsche defines nihilism as the radical repudiation of value, meaning, and desirability, it is recognized as both cultural malady and cure. In that nihilism helps dismantle the highest truth, but at the same time, the repudiation of higher meaning makes our society sick. One of the best films to illustrate this Western form of nihilism is Lars von Trier's Melancholia. This film is also about a apocalyptic scenario where a gigantic planet is about to collide with the Earth. The depressive female protagonist, Justine, an existential nihilist, wallow in her depression. Such a Kierkegaardian representation of sickness unto death helps shake Western conception of nihilism. Here, Nietzsche's prescription for the abyss of nihilism is his Übermensch therapy, where he believes that the creativity alone can overcome falling prey to the abyss of nihility or meaninglessness. Our current society can be seen as the product of such a Nietzschean therapeutic model. The techno-capitalist entrepreneurs that embrace and celebrate the spirit of innovation, creativity, and individuality can be considered Nietzsche's poster children. The tech billionaire Sir Peter Ishwell in Don't Look Up is a prime example of this, of the danger by the post-Nietzschean innovation-driven overman. Just before the politician decide to destroy the upcoming comet hitting the Earth, Ishwell intervenes and proposes to mine the comet's rare elements based on a risky, overreaching plan that depends on experimental technology. Here he is presented as a lone wolf, innovative genius, and thought leader in the model of Steve Jobs. But all his trendy buzzword and fake progressiveness, just a cover for a plan to make more money and protect his own fellow elite. In the context of the capitalist Anthropocene, creativity and innovation, though they have produced our contemporary technological advancement, can be considered the culmination of the domination of human meaning over the chaos of the natural world. Shouldn't we consider a possible alternative reading of our obsession with creativity, innovation, and meaning as a colonial project against our planet? Are our innovative technologies of using big data or charts to translate and map the meaning of climate change a form of cocooning us from reality? Instead of taking the climate crisis as an ultimatum to learn to live with uncertainties or to stay with troubles, like Donna Haraway says, or to learn how to die, we are now yoking creativity to planetary apocalypse. So now I'm finally moving on to Buddhism. Let's see. So every time we try to overcome nihilism by asserting meaning, we separate ourselves from the world. The impulse to construct meaning is exacting a heavy toll on planetary well-being. Some people, such as Roy Scranton, have already begun to question the legitimacy of calling for narrative as our cultural strategy for cure. In his book, Learning to Die in the Anthropocene, he takes on a position which I would consider to be on a nihilistic spectrum of the Anthropocene end time. For a Buddhist standpoint, to learn to live with the Anthropocene uncertainties on the existential phenomenological level begins with dismantling our reliance on ideas, concepts, and meaning. And this is what Buddhists mean by learning to die. So contrary to Nietzsche's Wubimish creative model, which calls for more meaning, the Buddhist spiritual strategy of negation argues that producing more fresh, innovative ideas will only deepen our gap between humanity and the world. A Buddhist pharmacon is to close the gap by removing concepts and meaning that gives in the way a genuine intimacy with the 10,000 things. As mentioned before, humans are meaning or concept-driven species. Our mind secretes concept like a protected cocoon, shielding us from reality for the sake of preserving our own sense of self and identity. This cocooning process has isolated us from the world. So to liberate ourselves from the cage of ideas, Chan therapy employs a apophatic or negative method to cut open the cocoon. One of the most powerful and popular images comes to mind is Manjushri holding Wenshu Shili Pusa, holding the sword, cutting off our habitual patterns of ideas, meaning, and value construction, which mediates between us and the world and hence shields us from seeing reality as it is. Chan Gong'an training is a spiritual technology rooted in the soteriology, 修行. That is why I'm calling for a new type of eco-critical praxis that is Chan soteriologically informed. It aims to rectify our concepts, if not challenging its validity altogether. As a form of psychosomatic training, we know koan as a method to help us loosen our grip on the idea or meaning. The momentary experience of letting go of idea triggers what in Chan is called the enlightenment experience, 开悟. In this experience, we have a glimpse into what it means to connect with things phenomenologically without mediation of concepts. Well, you can always try to capture it with language. So in a way, we still need to rely on language, isn't it? But with this experience, there is a change in the character of experience where we feel secure, blissful, selfless, and more importantly, we feel connected. The whole koan literature can be viewed as a genre of negation that aims to do away dualistic concepts from which meaning derives. In this sense, we can see Gong'an as a therapeutic genre that cures our compulsion for meaning. Take Wumen Huikai, the Master Wumen Huikai's The Gate of Gateless, Wumen Guan, as an example. The title, The Gate of Nothingness, Wumen, accentuates nothingness, or Wu, as the entry, rite of passage into the experiential world, into Prajna Paramita, which means transcendental wisdom, 般若智慧, that is characterized by non-dualistic interconnectedness of all things. Before I move to talk about how such an emptiness experience is paradoxical experience of fullness, I should first talk about negation as a mind training method that cures our compulsion for meaning. In this collection, Master Wumen has this first koan, 狗子佛性, has the dog Buddha nature as the first koan to highlight the importance of nothingness in Zen practice. This koan goes like this. A disciple asks Zen master Zhao Zhou if a dog has Buddha nature, to which Zhao Zhou replies, no, or nothingness. Here, Wu has two interrelated functions. The first function serves as an apophatic tool. It is Manjushri's sword of cutting open the cocoon of ideas to expose ourselves to the world. On a more soterial philosophical level, the second function of Wu points at a transcendental, non-dualistic dimension of nihility or zeroness. which does not dwell in the secular dualistic concept in terms of having Buddha nature or not having Buddha nature. This transcendental nothingness as a relentless, apophatic, or negating tool against dualistic way of framing the world defies any secular, utilitarian, or mimetic appropriation. In a famous koan, 廓然无圣, vastness without sacrality, we again encounter such a method of negation. The koan is about a legendary encounter between Liang Wudi, the emperor Liang, and Bodhidharma in the 15th century China. The emperor is a devoted Buddhist, and he has built many temples and copied sutras. So here's the conversation between these two. Let's see, oops. When the emperor asked how much merit he has acquired, Bodhidharma answered, merit in terms of building temples and copying sutras. Bodhidharma answered, none. And then the emperor asked again, what is the first principle of the sacred truth? The Bodhidharma replied again, vast emptiness, nothing sacred. And finally, Emperor Wu asked again, who is facing me? Or who is this person in front of me? To which Bodhidharma replied, don't know. Bodhidharma's negation aimed to cut off Emperor Wu's illusion of ideas in terms of having merits or not having merits. This comes from a utilitarian value system that is not altruistic or based on a teaching of compassion. Here we see Bodhidharma demonstrating the Zen or Chan apophatic method as a tool to knock down Emperor Wu's compulsion for meaning and value. The threefold negations of Bodhidharma of no values, emptiness without sacrality, or not knowing, gestures at a transcendental, non-dualistic dimension. But this koan does not go into it. So we have to move to another koan for that. The transcendental, non-dualistic dimension is further explored in another koan, which is called 龙潭吹竹, long time blowing candles. This koan is about a Zen master, De Shan, who is a Buddhist scholar and commentator of the Diamond Sutra, Jingang Jing, who came from northern China to the south to see Master Long Tan. So now let me read the koan. De Shan asked Long Tan about Chan far into the night. Eventually, Long Tan said, the night is late now. Why don't you retire for the evening? De Shan made his bow and lifted the blinds to withdraw. But he was met by darkness. Turning back to Long Tan, he said, it's very dark outside. Long Tan lit the paper candle and handed it to him. De Shan was about to take it when Long Tan blew it off. At this, all of a sudden, De Shan went through a deep experience and made vows. Long Tan said, what sort of realization do you have? And he answered, from now on, I will not doubt the words of an old Zen master who is renowned everywhere under the sun. Now I want to, so I missed that page. Anyway, so basically here the blowing out the experience triggered this kind of this in Zen we call the great death experience. So this is the experience of the transcendental illuminous fullness. But now I want to move into how this experience is connected to an idea of interconnectedness, and I'll use the last koan to explain. Different from the existential nihilism, which brings one into the abyss of despair, the Buddhist nothingness is entry into intimacy of interconnectedness. Practitioners who work on this particular koan, 百战独坐大雄风, by Zhang's sitting alone on Mount Daxiong illustrate this intimate connection. So the koan goes like this. A monk asked Bai Zhang, "What is the extraordinary affair?" Bai Zhang said, "Sitting alone on Mount Daxiong." The monk bowed, and Bai Zhang thereupon hit him. Here we can read the act of hitting the monk as an apophatic gesture to prevent the monk from taking the answer literally or conceptually, without exploring it experientially. In this pithy, therefore highly deceptive koan, what is not spoken beyond the simple statement points to a crucial dimension of reality. That is the fusion of emptiness and interconnectedness. This deceptiveness of koan is likened to that of Apollonian veil, where the valence of languages and concepts awaits to be disconstructed. Here, to take this koan as a therapeutic tool or medicine, the practitioner needs to focus on the keyword, alone, or du. So by meditating on the huatou, du, she may first go through a whole spectrum of experiences associated with aloneness, which may include isolated, depressed, or even suicidal feelings. But as her concentration deepens, she will eventually arrive at the other shore, or to borrow the mantra of Gate Gate in the Heart Sutra, Xing Jing, which means go to the other shore. Or I can say she will arrive at the deeper layer of the consciousness where the sense of existential isolation disappears. And this sense of meaning-free emptiness where one's own identity is lost is the most profound moment of interconnectedness. And in there, we are one with 10,000 things. We are mountains, rivers, air, and all these things around us. The I and thou, as Martin Buber says, identification includes our mimetic other or object of desire. In this sense, we are the pollution, we are climate change, we are toxic waste, we are whatever we create. And this is the basic teaching of the Yogacara school of Buddhism, 万法唯心, isn't it? We are not separate from the external environment as they are the product of our meaning or our consciousness. From here, we give rise to a newfound solidarity as we co-thrive, co-perish with all meanings around us. We are not separate from them as it is not possible to draw a line between a me and a non-me from a Zen perspective. So finally, I come to my conclusion. Here, I offer a couple of takeaway points. If we reframe eco-criticism in terms of in-eco-criticism or absence scholarship, then what we need to do is to identify the misdiagnosed cultural malady and solution. In this talk, I argue that we have a tendency to default to meaning as a cultural strategy. Such a tendency has drawbacks as it compels us to focus only on the feedback loop between nihilism and Anthropocene crisis, where we identify nihilism solely as pathology that we need to overcome. So for example, here, I cannot say, okay. So there is a crisis that is happening in the world. And this crisis, it creates sort of nihilistic crisis, existential crisis in us. And in order to respond, we construct meaning to combat nihilism. And when we create, different group of people create different meanings, and that creates a sort of mimetic conflict. And this conflict further deepens the crisis. So in our world, so it becomes this feedback loop. We overlook the power or of our nihilphobia, and this overlook delays the healing process of transformation from current Anthropocene to a post-Anthropocene order, because our fear of nothingness drives us to churn out more meanings as a form of self-defense or preservation. This will continue to trap us in the stage of denial and refuse to accept the demise of our unsustainable civilization and lifestyle. The Chinese therapy I'm proposing here is a spiritual strategy that works to decondition our meaning-seeking mind and denialism by using nothingness or emptiness to peel off its layered of cocoons of meanings so as to remain open and connected with things around us. Emptiness is a pill we need to take in the Anthropocene end time, as famously stated by the Indian philosopher Nagarjuna in Madhyamaka, Longshu the Zhonglun says, because of emptiness, all dharma are possible to be established, as all things arise out of this vast emptiness. Before we were able to form genuine relationship predicated on compassion and equality with all equal lives, we have to first go through the gate of gatelessness or nothingness, 无门. We first need to allow ourselves to plummet into the abyss of nothingness so as to come out on the other side to establish the post-Anthropocene world. And thank you for sitting through my hour-long meaningless talk. And I hope you enjoy my calligraphy. Thank you very much.
So let's see. Now, as I understand it, I shall offer some kind of response. Is that correct? Is that what? Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. So I want to say that hearing the talk after reading it has made it even more compelling to me. I have three different responses to your talk. The first one is that it's possible for somebody to offer a crude critique of your argument that would go like this. Somebody would say, okay, so Chan has this dimension of encountering the world, but there's 500 million or more Buddhists in the world. There's 300 million in mainland China. There's 70 million in Japan. You know, the environmental crisis is as intense, unfolding as intensely and destructively there as anywhere else, right? So that would be the first criticism. And, you know, I think that the answer to that would have to do with colonialism, right? I mean, it's definitely the case that before the Western powers invaded China, China had already engaged in many different forms of environmental degradation. But I do think, in defense of your argument, one could say that, you know, in a way, it's difficult to test your thesis using history because the West hasn't really given the world the option of trying your thesis, right? I mean, if I'm making any sense, it's sort of late in the day. But, you know, Western cultural and political and economic hegemony have imposed categories of understanding on the world non-negotiably. And it seems to me one virtue of your paper is that you're trying to pick up the pieces and reverse this sort of epistemological onslaught that the West has engaged in. So I think your paper is really praiseworthy, and I don't think the crude argument, well, you know, Buddhists destroy the environment too, is really fair, because I don't think Buddhist culture has had an opportunity to exercise its authority in the modern world, or exercise its influence, I should say, in the modern world. So that's one thing I wanted to put on the table. Since I've raised the issue of Western cultural imperialism, I'd like to also point out that one way to understand the history of the West is as a constant evasion of emptiness or nothingness. That really, you could start with. I mean, it's interesting. People don't necessarily realize this in the West, but the word chaos in Greek means nothingness or emptiness. You know, early pre-Socratic Greek philosophers imagined that the world begins with emptiness. But you know, by the time you get to the Socratic philosophers, you get to Plato and especially Aristotle, there's an attempt to escape or repress that kind of an emptiness. So, you know, Aristotle is the classical Apollonian thinker. He creates this world of the world that he describes as visible to reason, or he describes only the world that is visible to reason, right? And this is connected to the project of, you know, masculine Greek hegemony over the Mediterranean. It's connected to Athenian political mastery and so on, and also the mastery of the male aristocrats. You know, that 10% of the population that had access to political power. So there's a repression of emptiness right at the beginning of Greek culture, and there's also a repression of emptiness at the beginning of Jewish culture. So, you know, let me just briefly read the first line of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And what happens is God represses that emptiness, and then he creates the world, and he gives the world to human beings, right? So God is like the you know, in the Jewish Bible, God is like the shield, right, between emptiness and humanity. And when he arrives on the scene, he awards creation. He subjects creation to human dominance. He literally gives humans dominion over the natural world. And what happens is that you have this Greek strand of repressing emptiness, and you have this Jewish strand of repressing emptiness. And Christianity is a fusion of Jewish messianic historicism and basically classical Greek idealism, right? Basically, so Christianity brings these two things together, and God is like the guarantor of our protection from emptiness, right? And somebody like Aquinas picks up Aristotle's idea of God as pure being, right? So God is being, protecting us from non-being. Okay, so I think there's this theme of Western evasion of emptiness right from the beginning. And when you look at somebody like Nietzsche, I think your reading of Nietzsche is right on the money. I think it's so wonderful because, you know, Nietzsche realizes that emptiness is coming, or there's a crisis precipitated by science and modernity, industrialization, that makes emptiness accessible again. And Nietzsche confronts that, the famous thing about if you look into the void, it looks back into you. But you're right. I think Nietzsche evades that emptiness. He sees the task in the face of emptiness. The task of the Übermensch is to be like God, to be the protector against emptiness through creativity, right? And that's a second missed opportunity for the West. You know, I think the third missed opportunity is World War II, where you have something like 200 million people killed, right? You have 20 million Russians killed, you know, and so on. And, you know, Sartre is engaging with emptiness, but in a way that's reminiscent, I think, of you get being and nothingness, right? But, you know, nothingness doesn't have, I defy somebody to read that and come and say that nothingness has a positive or affirmative or creative valence in Sartre. So it's another opportunity missed. And then, you know, after World War II, you have people like D.T. Suzuki, Lu Kuan Yu, and people from the Kyoto School making their way into the West and talking about emptiness. So there's, again, this openness, and you get these people like Karen Horney or Eric Fromm or John Cage or Fritz Perl, all of these people interested in East Asian culture, in Buddhism, and then it closes off again. One way to understand post-structuralism, even though people don't necessarily understand it, one way to understand post-structuralism is that it's really a reaffirmation of some fundamental Western tropes, that basically historically the West has this period of about 20 years after World War II where it begins to entertain seriously the possibility that these paradigms coming from East Asia could be valid. And then, post-structuralism turns right back into Eurocentric worldview. And even somebody like Derrida, who's often used to critique Eurocentrism, is interesting to me because, Derrida says there's nothing outside the text. What it almost is saying is outside the text, there's just nothingness, right? So we have to stay within language. So I mean, I think you could make that case anyway. All right. So I think Derrida too is involved in the repression of emptiness, and I would like to say that he hovers on the margin. He hovers on the margin of emptiness, but he's constantly slipping from emptiness back into language and emptiness back into meaning. And he's playing with the instability of meaning, but he's not able to confront what's on the other side of that line. Okay. So the third thing I'd like to say is just that I do think we need to interrogate this word, this English word, transcendence, right? Which is, I think, perhaps leading us into a misunderstanding of what Buddhism is really up to. So it's very common in the literature on Buddhism in the West to talk about enlightenment as a transcendent experience, and prajnaparamita is often translated as transcendental wisdom. But what prajnaparamita really means perfected wisdom, the perfection of wisdom. So I would like to say that I don't think Buddhist enlightenment is a transcendent experience. I think that the Western idea of a transcendent experience has a long history that goes back to the Greeks too, and to ancient Jewish tradition. But for me, the paradigm of transcendence in the West is Sophocles' Oedipus at Colonus. And it's a fascinating book because Oedipus is this famous figure from the Sophocles' first Oedipus play. And Oedipus basically commits these crimes unknowingly and pays a terrible price while he's trying to save his city. And in the second Oedipus play, he's plucked out his eyes in contrition, but he's become this liminal figure who actually has taken on the sins of his society. And at the end of the play, basically he's taken up into heaven. He's actually the redeemer of his civilization, and he's taken up into heaven and joins the gods. Christianity adopts this same schema, right? Jesus is the suffering servant of his people. He endures suffering. He's taken up into heaven. Whoever wrote this Jesus story must have read Oedipus at Colonus because they're structurally identical. Okay, so anyway, I'm not trying to debunk Christianity, but the point is that idea of being taken out of the world is Western transcendence. And Buddhist enlightenment is not transcendence, in my view. It's radical immanence. So the Buddhist view is that we have surrounded reality with our projections and our symbolic structures, and to the degree that it's totally occluded. We can't encounter the real because our karma, our mental habits prevent us from encountering it. So enlightenment isn't going up into the sky, it's stripping away the power of the whole symbolic order and encountering the real, right? So it's radical immanence rather than transcendence. And I think that would support your argument. You see, I think that this idea of emptiness as dangerous, and meaning is thought to be transcendent too, right, in the West. So in the beginning was the New Testament begins, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. So language comes from the transcendent in the West, right? And of course, in Buddhist thinking, language is constantly understood as an obstacle, as occluding the real. So anyway, maybe I should just stop there and see if you have any responses to that. Jaru, I think you're muted. Oh.
Okay. I was just talking about the sort of your comments on the term transcendent. I wasn't necessarily thinking in terms of the Western sense, because I was thinking in terms of the gate, you know, the Heart Sutra, right? Going to the other shore, So for me, it's not necessary in terms of the sort of or verticals kind of a transcendent, right? Going from heaven, from earth to heaven, right? And or to the other realm, but more in terms of the Heart Sutras type of a transcendence. I don't know how you make of that. You know, would that be could that be a transcendent in the? Could we understand the transcendent in terms of the radical immanence, not necessarily transcendent in the Western sense? I don't know.
Well, I think it makes sense to think about it as a horizontal rather than vertical, right? And it's almost like transgressive rather than transcendent, right? The Buddha's rejecting the symbolic order, right? And I think it's a very different. I mean, I like the idea that it's a vertical experience, not a horizontal. I mean, it's a horizontal experience, not a vertical one.